Hey everybody, Frederick here. I have a jam-packed 30-minute session for you to hopefully inspire you, to challenge you on the topic of launching a lovable product. Now, there's many ways to launch a product in general. We're going to focus on the lovable aspect, the delightful aspect, the emotional aspect of launching a product that sticks, that brings down churn. And people talk a lot about launching fast in general, which is this sort of sentiment that we want to get something out really quickly, but we do see a tendency for that to hurt the reputation of the company, the brand. So having just shifting your mindset slightly can add a lot of benefits to launching something that you've been building and working on and very passionate about for a long time. If you don't already know, my name is Frederick. I've been designing software for 10 years now. It doesn't feel like a long time. It certainly is, but the designing software is changing so much nowadays, especially with all the AI happening too. So it's a very exciting time to design software. But there's also, because of this, not necessarily only the AI part, but just in general, people have huge expectations of software, depending on the industry you're in, obviously. But generally speaking, people have high expectations of how something works, feels, the quality of it. So it's very exciting. That's also why we have this topic today. I run a small design studio, EDL, and simply put, we design a lovable product. That's the reason we exist, and that's the reason why the clients we have like to work with us, because we take this more holistic view of the product experience. What to launch? So I wanted to just initially start off by comparing the different ways, and we've simplified it quite simply. There's a bunch of synonyms and different abbreviations of how, different models, the different mental models of what to launch and how to launch it. MVP is a classic one. That's typically what we see most people go for, which is just how quickly can we launch something that will provide us internally some sort of benefit, understanding of the thing we're building, is that the correct thing? And then on the flip side, we have the lovable, the minimal lovable product, which is, sure, it will take a bit longer and we'll have to put more resources and effort into it. And we'll probably build a little less than we would with the MVP, but hopefully that will create this stickiness early on. Hopefully the technology, the general development underneath is also pretty solid, because we put a bit more effort into it, because we're not going to throw it away afterwards. So there is no shortage of different ways of talking about launching things, and there's no right way either. So MVP has a huge purpose in certain instances, whereas the MLP has one too. And I think for most companies, I think the MLP is the right approach, but it obviously depends on the industry you're in and what you're trying to disrupt or create. The case story we have with us today is for ESG Cloud, which is we chose the MLP way, and I'll get into that in a minute. But I want to just mention some general pitfalls we see with these models, because none of them are perfect. And the two big ones for the MLP segment is we see misaligned tech choices, and we see over engineering. The over engineering is obviously, and it also relates to design by committee, which is we set out to build something super niche and super specific, but we tend to stay in this need for perfection, and we have this mentality of just another feature, like this will really create the stickiness, this will create the delight, the wow moment. So we end up staying in this loop for a long time until everything gets a bit too bloated, and we don't get to launch anything and learn anything until it's potentially too late, that we wasted a lot of resources on things we shouldn't. Design by committee is the same principle. Misaligned tech choices relates to and this maybe is more related to MVPs, because we tend to see MVP as being a thing that should kind of get thrown out after we've validated what we wanted to validate. Like, the reason why we launched the MVP is to get input on the thing we're building. We tend to make some choices because we're doing it quickly in terms of the tech. That might not be ideal, but we don't necessarily throw out the MVP as we should. We continue to build on top of this, and this creates a lot of technical debt, a lot of bloat, which is hard to get rid of early or later. So this misaligned tech choices also relates to the MLP, but we take our time with the MLP so we can make some more conscious decisions and better conscious decisions around the tech stack. On the MVP side, we got the under polishing, which I think is the biggest kind of turn off and like issue with the MVP approach, because we're doing something fast and because we want to figure out if this is the right thing to build and throw a lot of resources after, potentially get some sort of investment so we can build this thing, we see that we tend to under polish it, obviously, but that creates this issue on the end customer side, because we lose credibility, we lose trust very early on if the technology is not really working the way it should, like the dashboard is showing misleading figures, or the workflows we've established doesn't really fit into this mold that we've created. So we're not able to show the value that the MVP actually provides. And therefore we lose the one shot we have of retaining this user and making them excited. I've laid it out in a more simplified table, and I just want to quickly run over the main things. If we look on the left side, we have the different aspects of launching a product and what a project entails. There is obviously a lot more to it, but some of the ones I like to usually take a look at when we have this discussion is feature scope. So what should this thing do, like this feature over here? The MVP approach is usually very minimal because we just want to test something. Whereas the MLP approach, which you will see in the case story we have in a minute, is way more curated. Like, we take some intentional choices, we're very clear in what we want to achieve, and this comes off as usually one or two really hyper-focused features. On the UX policy side, MVPs are usually basic. Like, usually there's not even any UX resource as in like a UX designer involved in this process. It might just be the devs taking the role of UX and making something that just feels about right and is functional enough for people to use. Whereas on the other end, we put a lot more effort into this, which is, of course, more costly and there's more risk involved. But that polish should create these wow moments that we're going for the MLP to kind of do what it's set out to do. Time to market, very fast on the left side, typically moderate to a bit longer on the right side. Like MLPs, we try to stay lean, but it often kind of goes into taking a bit longer than initial. But we've done our pre-work in this case, so it shouldn't be that high of a risk in terms of time to market. So that should be okay with us. Risk and reward, talking about risk, high risk on the MVP side, balanced on the right side. Now, there is a bit of the high risk on the MVP side might seem a bit weird because there is low investment, but the low stickiness is what I'm focusing on here, because the risk is high because the way we look at acquiring customers, is that we have this one shot. Like, we don't have multiple times that we can demo a piece of software, show it off, and get this nice reaction to it. And once people have made up their mind about a certain piece of software in a particular industry, that sticks, and that kind of carries on in the daily conversations they have with colleagues or people at other companies. So that's the high risk aspect of the MVP in my mind. With that in mind, the general concepts in the back of our head, let's move into the case story. I have a few things I really want to talk about with ESG Cloud because it's a very fascinating case story for me. I'm very proud of the work we've done for them. But to give you some backstory, obviously ESG Cloud is an ESG reporting tool. The main objective is for, let's say, me as a small business owner to get in here and do my reporting, get my numbers straight, collect all the data, and essentially export a PDF at the end. We had, for this particular project, we had a very tight timeline in terms of we want to launch something by this date. That for us was, in terms of design, was 3 months. So we really had to buckle up and get make some choices and do some calculated risk taking in terms of what we also chose to focus on. On the left side, if you can see it, it is very much the accessibility might be an issue here. But my main point with these two sections is that on the right side, we have something that is very intentional, something that you won't see in most software, and even in ESG tools, you probably won't find this integrated so deeply into the product. And on the left side, we have a grid of a bunch of anonymous features. Now, anonymous features is not necessarily bad. It's just generic, and it doesn't necessarily provide the value that we want to provide. So the stickiness is less because we might as well just choose product B or C because they can do the same things. Where on the right side, we're being very intentional about what we want to do and what we think the users need for them to fall in love with the product, have some sort of emotional reaction to it, and obviously stay using the product. So it really comes down to knowing your audience, like when approaching this, but this is how we chose to do it for ESG Cloud, really digging into some of the users' workflows. The only reason why we're able to do this is because we're very pragmatic generally when we look at the foundational stuff. So we have UI kits that are highly polished nowadays. Like, there's no reason, I can't come up with one at least, so feel free to challenge me on this, but there's no reason for you or your dev team to develop these foundational pieces of a product experience nowadays, because somebody have already done it. They've done it very, very well, both in terms of responsiveness, accessibility, all these different aspects that we're very focused on. That just takes a lot longer than we expect. Calendar pickers, menu navigation, tables, all of this is stuff that your product will need. And if we as designers are able to make this conscious decision of saying, hey, there's a lot of return of investment of us not being very having an ego and needing to design this on our own, we can use something pre-built that works really well. Then let's do that, and then spend the 20%. Let's say this is 80% of the user experience. Let's spend the last 20% of us really getting down into the deeps, the granular stuff of figuring out how exactly these two hyper-focused features should work to provide this additional on-top value. This is already going to be great. You can see it in the next slides here, that this is one of the examples of where we chose to provide the value. So the screenshot you see in front of us is a mock-up of one direction we could have taken, which would be the MVP approach. So without going too much into detail about ESG tooling and reporting, when the user sets up a tool, for example, double materiality, they can do two things. So the simple approach would be to say, we have this Excel template that ESG provides. You can download it, you can fill it out on your own, and you can upload it to ESG Cloud. Then, hey, we have all the ESG stuff you need for your report inside ESG Cloud. Done. The way we chose to approach it was to say, we have an opportunity here in the customer journey of creating this aha moment, which is this light bulb moment for the user when they go through the experience. And instead of having them to do this context switching of going from ESG Cloud, which is a system they want to use, to Excel or whatever, even though Excel is wonderful and most people in this industry would be comfortable using it, it just creates a much more intuitive, easily onboardable experience to have this in here. Sure, it takes a lot longer to implement, to conceptualize, to discuss in meetings, how can we nail this function? But it also becomes, one thing is a good user experience. The other part is it becomes great sales material. It looks great in PowerPoint slides. When people are comparing prices and apples and pears and whatever they're comparing, when we have different ESG software, this will stand out because somebody have chosen to take an intentional approach to designing a feature. We can't undermine that, especially not in the early stages of trying to define your brand as an ESG reporting SaaS tool provider. So this goes a long way. Another great example, and these are the two ones I want to kind of highlight, is when you create these reports, you obviously you go into this data collection mode where you have certain disclosure requirements decided by the EU that we need to know, let's say, the gender gap in your organization, or in this case, disclosing whether or not how many your assets and activities have been screened in order, and so on. It's not so important. What I want to focus on is the blue box. This is task management. It's very basic. There's nothing extreme about it. What we've chose to do, though, is go the extra mile when it comes to collecting this data. Now, in front of you, you see we have to enter a value, and there's a euro unit at the end. That's a drop down. It can be switched around for a more enjoyable user experience. Now, we could have just gone with a straight up, like a big text field. We could have had no opinion about the type of content we want the user to provide. We could have said, from a US perspective, we don't want to show, is it a small value? Is it a big value? Do we want a lot of content? Do we want a little? Like those things, when a user sees a text input field, if it's tiny, if the width is very short, we know we should have in system code when we do go through an e-commerce flow. And there's reasons for that, because we associate the value that we put into a field with the size of it. For example, something very simple like that. So us being able to differentiate between we want some sort of valuta, like financial value, or in this case, we have a task type, which is of a table. And again, we've decided to spend more effort than potentially needed if we were focused on the MVP approach. By creating this customizable table, there is a sensible default, but the user can create rows and columns as you would see in most other software providing some sort of table editing experience. This could have been substituted with an Excel sheet like we talked about before. Download this template, fill it out, upload it. The added benefit of this is also that we get more control over the data in general, because we have been intentional about what we want from the user. Therefore, we can much easier insinuate like this is what it's for. We can show it in certain ways in the UX and the UI, which is also very exciting. But this is just two pain points on a customer journey that's not necessarily very fun for a user to go through, like the ESG flow. So this is a nice aha moment on the way. I've tried to visualize it here. We have the MVP flow at the top and we have the MLP at the bottom. I'll show you the MLP in a minute. But looking at the MVP approach, we have, and if you look at the graph, that's kind of the general sentiment the user have when they go through the process. Are they happy? Are they sad? Are they frustrated? This is obviously extremely simplified, but we have a simple onboarding that goes with both flows. We prioritized having a decent onboarding without too many bells and whistles. It just had to work very nicely. We have that good experience. We come in and we get kind of confronted with the reality that sure, we're using ESG Cloud, but now we need to also use Excel. And for the most part, use Excel because we're just downloading templates, filling it out, and then storing it. It's essentially a glorified database of Excel files. So that might be okay. We have a neutral opinion about that because we're fine with Excel. It can do more stuff than ESG Cloud can, of course. But when we come to the data collection point, we're pretty far in the customer journey. And this is where the issues might arise for a business owner like me I might not have the same level of understanding of ESG reporting than other people have. So this becomes a huge frustration point, and I might churn, like I might leave and never come back because it was just too overwhelming to use ESG Cloud. As opposed to the approach that we took and the way we feel about the approach we took, you see there are two spikes, which is generally what we call these aha moments, as I mentioned before. And this is what creates stickiness because this is where we provide the value. So same onboarding, is working very nicely with the matrix in line. And again, we get to the data collection point. It might not be me who need to do the data collection, but in the MVP approach, I'm not comfortable necessarily sharing or delegating people to put in information because it's not super clear what we need. Whereas in this more opinionated approach that we took to design and that ESG Cloud obviously was heavily involved in, and the tech people, also the devs, agreed that this is worth our effort. This creates just so many levels of interesting things for the user experience, for the general commercial value too, of getting more people on board in this sort of flow. Key takeaways. I have 4 general key takeaways, which is just generally based on our experience working with ESG Cloud, but also just in general trying to focus on creating lovable products. So align on take early. I talked about that a bit, but for an MLP to be super successful, we need to remove this friction between design and dev, and that could be by having a UI kit, for example. So removing this sort of friction of creating something wonderful and then spending the time we have as designers to focus on the 20% is really strong. I cannot stress enough, the relationship between devs and design in this process is really important. No silos, we need to work crisscross, but I can talk about that for a long time. The only way we can get quotes like this, and this is not ESG Cloud, this is from Auto Budgets, but this is from a senior developer. The only way we can get these sort of quotes of like happy sentiments around what we do is when we take this approach. Like we meet the devs where they are. They are our first user as designers, so we need to be very mindful of that. Now, if we want to aim for delight, we also need to measure delight, and there's many ways to do this, but just generally speaking, user feedback surveys. We need to go beyond Google Analytics. We're not using Google Analytics anyway. It's just there. We need to do some in-app micro polls. After a certain flow, we need to trigger a pop-up and we need to say, how was that? Get some continuous feedback. So tools to use for session recordings too, like these general replays, could be a tool like Post Hoc. There's many, Clarity from Microsoft. But we also need to look into support ticket sentiment. So how are people reacting to the things we do? Because we need to continuously do this to make sure that the experience keep being a delight, because users create this sort of, they get expectations once they have a nice product experience. We also want to plan for scale. So relates a bit to the aligning on the tech stack early, but Once we start growing, we want to layer in features, but we want to keep the same level of polish. And again, users have expectations at this point, so we can't just fool around and create MVP stuff all of a sudden. Also, iterative improvements is very important, incremental steps. We don't want to just launch a whole new something over here. We want to do it slowly, step by step. Desk research, very excited about desk research in general. Obviously, it's not a substitute for not doing your normal research, like going into the field, speaking with your users, but sitting at your desk, there are many new possibilities too with AI. So generally speaking, look at the competitors. What are they doing? What are they not doing very well? What kind of gaps can you fill with the light? What can you take? That could be performance. That could be a general user flow. How can we improve this? And this is where you can easily separate yourself from the rest, especially if you're in an industry with a lot of legacy competitors that built the software a long time ago and they're just resting on the glory of that. That will create some opportunity spotting for you. You'll be able to pinpoint exactly how can we take some of these customers over here and create loyal customers in our business. Talking about AI, I want to shout out Perplexity, and I just want to generally make you aware of the fact that AI is a great tool for this. Competitor analysis and finding these gaps, depending on what industry you're in. This is just a simple prompt I've created, but there are many ways to handle this nicely. We can go into Google reviews, Trustpilot, we can look at Reddit, different forums to find real user feedback that we can take and utilize in our product, which is insane and very exciting. So this gives you some sort of general overview of user pain points for competitors, which is very exciting. So take a look at that. Do it for yourself. Make a great prompt about it. Finally, before I give you like our general approach to creating an MLP, I just want to highlight this mindset shift, which is quality is business strategy. We talk about this a lot in general about quality in your product is on the same level as doing marketing or doing sales. Like it creates the same level of loyalty, business, commercial value. And I have this quote, I'm not going to read it out loud, but look into a tool like Linear, which is creating a issue tracking tool, essentially, which is a super saturated market. It's project management at its finest, but they've managed to build a quality product and take a huge chunk of market share just because they're so hyper-focused on quality, creating not MVPs, MLPs, and focusing on providing this value really early on, and people stick to that. Finally, here towards the end of my 30 minutes, I have a step-by-step guide to building lovable products. There's nothing like hugely insane about it, or it's not rocket science. But essentially, what we have here is a step-by-step guide of how we would approach building this. So we need to get this understanding of what creates this wow moment, what's the emotional impact of what we're doing. We need to move on into rapid discovery, and this is where we need to map out the user journeys, find the pain points, potentially use some AI to assist us. We need to scope and prioritize exactly like these 1 to 3 features that we really want to focus on, and make sure that this is the differentiating factor of our product. Then we need to align, design, and dev. We talked about that, applying some sort of UI kit, which is enormously valuable. And then we need to prototype and validate before we do too much. Again, this is, we need to run some usability sessions, we need to talk to users, and we need to make sure that what we're building is good. Again, AI is great for this too. Polish and prep for launch, refine everything, make sure no errors, we don't have room for this. So everything just has to play out nicely until we gain their respect, until we gain their loyalty. And then we have to obviously measure success. And there's a bunch of ways to do this. There's the functional ones like task completion rate, and there's also the more delightful ones, which is NPS, or just general user sentiment. How are we feeling about the product? Plan and iteration roadmap is the final thing, and this is because the product keeps on growing. Like we're going to keep building this thing. So loop customers in for feedback for the next MLP rounds, the cycles of the sprints, and make sure to communicate the updates and the enhancement that you do, because that again creates this stickiness that they're involved in the process. That was 30 minutes of a lot of information. Yes, I'm very hot too. There's these lights. Can I go dry my forehead, and then the questions can roll in?
Now we'll show you.
Cool. If you have any questions, if anybody is listening online, then go ahead. Feel free.
I can ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
So people drop everything that they wonder. But in the ESG cloud project, how did you decide which wow factors that you wanted to go for?
It's a great question, because usually we would figure that out by speaking to real people. Unfortunately, for this particular project, we kind of skipped that and went a lot on intuition and desk research, as I mentioned, because for a few reasons. One is that that space at that time was not really super developed, so there wasn't like a whole lot of people to speak to about this sort of thing, and the people we would speak to wouldn't necessarily know what they wanted from this sort of brand new way of working with a tool like this that is hyper focused. Plus, it was very early days. It's not really an excuse that there was a tight timeline, because we can easily fit that in regardless. But that is usually the reason why people would not do it, that excuse. But for us, it was lack of resources in that department, both in terms of people we could speak to, but also just the industry not being fully grown yet. So intuition and just general experience, trying to pinpoint exactly where we could create value. And that also came through just speaking to ESG experts that ESG Cloud had internally, which there's not like a whole lot of them as far as I'm concerned, at least not back then. But that gave us a lot of good insights in where the journey could be improved.
We got a question from a LinkedIn user, can't see your name unfortunately, but how do you define quality and how do you measure it?
How do you define or find?
Define
quality. And that's a great question, because it really depends on the industry. Like, I mean, quality is like how things work, how things feel, which is very abstract, and also why quality is very hard to find in a lot of modern software. Like, obviously there is a lot of quality, and Linear is a great example of that. Airbnb is a great example of that. We have some great examples of that. But quality is really UX, obviously, having a good understanding of what workflow, like how the experience goes from A to C, and that's going to feel like quality. There is a general polish in terms of visuals, for example, how things react and feel when you use the software. There's some quality in that too. There is also just quality in terms of internal culture. And I think that's what most of these companies who's really good at nailing quality, they get right. They have an internal culture that is really highly focused on not being okay with making mediocre solutions or just launching something quickly. They might still miss the mark on certain things, but it rarely happens if you look at also apps like Duolingo or Netflix. Like they have some internal cultures where lovable is kind of the light, is the main mantra. So defining quality is an internal thing for your organization to kind of define for your users, but for most, it's good UX, it's high polish in the UI, it's being opinionated, and it's just creating a delightful experience overall. Measuring it comes through many things. Again, based on what you set up in terms of quality parameters, you can obviously you should define your metrics based on that. But common ones we see, and also as I mentioned throughout this, is completion rate could be an interesting one just from a functional perspective. Is quality for you, how quick can the end user do a certain thing in a project management tool, for example, or an ESG tool? That can be a stamp of quality that we're able to do it quickly if that's the thing. But also these more like NPS scoring, like just 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. Would you recommend this product? That also kind of gives you an idea of quality. Micro polling is another way, as I mentioned, to get like more granular feedback in terms of quality on user flows and different interactions. And then just talking with people and getting like anecdotal evidence that this is quality, speaking to the users of your software and getting a sense for what this, are we hitting the mark? Are we doing the things we set out to in terms of the goals we have? It's a very great question, and it's very difficult to define. And that's also why we don't see it as often, because it's not as easy as some of the other traditional metrics that we look at in terms of revenue and all these sorts of things.
Cool. Okay, I have another question. So could aiming for an MLP put you at risk of moving too slowly and like risking the competitors to take over the market with faster, less polished MVP?
Yes, that's one of the pitfall. I wouldn't say it's actually a pitfall, because I have a very strong opinion about the market is huge. Like there's so many people, and you not getting to the thing first, and Linear is a great example of this, coming after like creating a project management tool for bugs in software that we've seen a million times from giants like Atlassian or making Jira or Monday, Asana, you name it. There's so many. So I'm not so afraid of being late, because if you bring quality and a product that people have been missing, and you figure that out by, again, identifying these opportunities in your user experience, for example, people will come if you're able to communicate that strongly through marketing and sales, obviously. And Linear is, again, a wonderful example of that, because that is a saturated market, but they chose to be very, very intentional about the niche audience they focused on, which is generally developers and product managers, and then building a solution that just fits their way of working, which no tool has really done up until then, which is insane to think about in a space so crowded. So sure, people might come before you, and in the ESG space, we've seen a lot of solutions pop up after we started working with ESG Cloud, because it's just a very talked about topic. But putting some cold water in your veins, I'm not sure that's an expression in English, but just relaxing and taking a step back and then defining exactly what you want to achieve, I wouldn't be too afraid of spending additional time and having other solutions pop up. Because if you provide a better product experience, more quality, I'm sure they will come.
Okay, so if you, despite this, choose to go like start off small and fast instead, do you think it's harder to then go back and create something that users love?
Yes, it is. The MVP approach, just in the roots of it, is that you build something that is very hard to scale, because you build something extremely fast and you focus on a specific subject. So once that is built, it's very hard to then let's build on top of this and make it delightful. You can obviously do that through user research. Once you've done the MVP, ideally you throw this to the side and then you build the real thing that is either 20% smaller or has a different perspective or a different scope. And then you're able to make something that's extremely delightful based on the MVP that you just built. A lot of resources goes into that, but in the long run, it's very well spent resources, because you figure out exactly how to do the delightful thing fast. You might also figure out that you shouldn't build this at all, which is also terrible, but nice in the long run, so you don't spend too much time on something that you don't want to build. So to your question, it's very difficult if you have this mindset of just continuing building on top of the MVP that you set out to build. But if you use it the right way as this testing tool that you can then toss to the side and then build the right MLP afterwards, then it's a great approach. there is room for both of them, as I mentioned too. So just have to use it smartly.
Okay. Should we wait another 2 minutes for last questions to pop up?
We can do that. But again, if there's any questions afterwards, we can always they can always reach out.
Do we have anything to add?
I don't like the topic is very broad, and this was very dense sessions with a lot of information. If there's any questions, as I said, reach out. I love talking about this and just generally talking about approaches to product development, because a lot of it comes through good design decisions initially. So feel free to reach out at any time. Other than that, I think we're good.
Yeah.
Bye.